I just think people need to be very careful here, especially given the things that are being said about the possibility that what this really is about is trying to depict Zelensky as carrying out Trump's will and Putin as the one who's resisting it in order to get Trump back on Ukraine's side and willing to fund the war as if none of all of this had actually happened.
That's an interesting suggestion from Glenn, because once this news of the ceasefire came out, I didn't really know what to think, because there's potential talk out there that this might be kind of a deal to get the U.S. back involved somehow, a gambit from people within the deep state to try to do exactly what Glenn just said. So the ceasefire raises all sorts of interesting questions, especially because Russia hasn't even agreed to it yet. But I want to hear what Glenn said, so let's listen and let's react to it.
One of the most notable aspects, I'd argue the defining aspect of the first Donald Trump presidential term, was that he surrounded himself with people who not only didn't share his agenda, but often were actively opposed to it. And while Trump constructed his team for the second term, I often pointed out that I had been told many times, I had come to also believe, that a lot of people close to Donald Trump were well aware that that was one of the major failings of the first Trump term, and they were determined not to allow that to happen again. And as Trump selected people who have long been advocates of the DC bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Washington about war and militarism, people like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, and Elise Stefanik at the UN, who's a clone of Nikki Haley and Liz Cheney. I'd long been saying, look, these people certainly have had a history of advocacy of the foreign policy that Trump says he opposes, but I believe that Trump is choosing people based on who will be personally loyal to his agenda and who will carry it out.
And it seems like actually Marco Rubio has done that to some extent so far, which really kind of shocked me because he was such an ardent neocon in the past. So I do think Glenn's right on this. It's playing out at least so far.
And one of the areas where this was most glaring was on Ukraine, where Trump had repeatedly said during the campaign, and for years in fact, that he thought that the Biden administration's policy of financing the war in Ukraine was a mistake and that he intended to end the war. And yet his top national security officials like Marco Rubio, like former Congressman Mike Waltz, now as National Security Advisor, were very hard-line supporters of Ukraine and Zelensky. And how that tension would be reconciled was one of the open questions of the second Trump administration. And we've seen Rubio and Mike Waltz and others be very publicly supportive, not of their prior views, but of Trump's views, including in those instances where they differ. The question is whether there will be an attempt in the second Trump administration for people like that to start subtly and in a manipulative way, once Trump starts paying less attention, to pursue their foreign policy rather than the foreign policy that Donald Trump says he supports.
I think it's guaranteed, and I think you'll see this in the form of attempts to drive wedges between his cabinet. Like, people will bring up past things that were feuds between the two, or, you know, try to purport that one betrays the other. I think it's guaranteed, and we'll just have to see.
And I think the first test of that is going to be what ends up happening with the U.S. relationship to Ukraine and Russia and the war that Donald Trump has vowed to end. Earlier this week, the Trump administration announced that it had proposed to Ukraine a 30-day ceasefire where hostilities would stop essentially along the front lines while a peace deal was going to be worked out. And lo and behold, President Zelensky not only agreed to it, but said all the things that Donald Trump said that he had wanted to hear from Zelensky. And as a result of Zelensky's agreeing to what the United States had proposed, the Trump administration's suspension of intelligence sharing with Ukraine, the provision of certain arms to Ukraine, was instantly lifted. There was this sense that, oh, look, Zelensky is now showing that he does want a peace deal, that he does want to work with the United States, that he is grateful for our support and is willing to do what we want. Here's Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz announcing this agreement, and you can get a sense for how it is that they're depicting it.
Today, we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. I want to personally thank, we both want to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, His Majesty, for hosting us, for making this possible. They've been instrumental in this process, and we're very grateful to them for hosting us here today. And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball is now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants.
I want to see that meme. Say the line. Say the line. He said it. The ball's in Russia's court.
The war to end, and I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
Now, you heard there that phrase, the ball is in Russia's court, and it's hard to overstate how many mouths that exact phrase came out of, not just inside the Trump administration, but all throughout Western Europe, including all the warmongers in Brussels who actually don't want the war to end. So the idea here is now, oh, look, Zelensky did the right thing. He's the one who now is showing that he's the man of peace. And the question is Putin someone who really wants the war to end and shares Trump's desire to make that happen?
Because if he doesn't, the people that want this war to be kind of revived, are relying on that, on him to turn it down and Zelensky to look like the peacetime dove. And I think that that's their objective. The people that want the war to continue but are cheering for the ceasefire, I think that's why.
Or is the real problem Putin? And that will be determined by whether Putin just accepts exactly what is given to him by the United States that Zelensky has already agreed to. Here's Zelensky, who clearly now is trying to reingratiate himself into the good graces of the Trump administration, announcing this as well. He's speaking here in Ukrainian, so I'm going to read the subtitles. We are ready to take this step to enact a 30-day ceasefire. The United States must convince Russia to do it. That is, we agree, and if the Russians agree, the ceasefire will start at that very moment. So you see the framework that's being created here, which is when Zelensky was in the Oval Office for that notoriously confrontational debate or disagreement with Trump and J.D. Vance and others, one of the criticisms that Trump made of Zelensky during that confrontation, but also before and after, was it seemed like he had no interest in negotiating a peace deal. So this is Zelensky, with the help of Marco Rubio, saying, oh, look, actually, no, Zelensky does want a peace deal. In fact, he agreed to the 30-day ceasefire that we offered him, and now the only real question is Russia and Vladimir Putin also really actually genuinely interested in the way Zelensky just proved that he was in a peace deal, and that will be determined by only one thing, and by one thing and one thing only, and that is whether Russia simply accepts the terms of this deal. Here's a statement issued by the Office of the President of Ukraine, which is a joint statement of the Ukrainian American delegations following their meeting in Saudi Arabia. Quote, Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the U.S. proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation. The United States will immediately lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. Lastly, both countries' presidents agreed to conclude as soon as possible a comprehensive agreement for Ukraine's critical mineral resources to expand Ukraine's economy and guarantee Ukraine's long-term prosperity and security. So in other words, it's not just that they created a framework where even the Europeans are saying, does Putin want an end to this war? And this, as they keep saying, the ball is now in his court. But also it resulted in the resumption of what is called U.S. security assistance to Ukraine and intelligence sharing, meaning all the military and other forms of support that the United States had been giving to Ukraine under the Biden administration that Trump suspended for a very short period of time, but that now has been reinstated. In addition to all of that, here from the New York Post, On Monday, you see the headline, Zelensky apologized to Trump in a letter last week over the Oval Office blow-up, Special Envoy Witkoff claims. So clearly you see here that there's an attempt by the Ukrainians and apparently by certain officials inside the Trump administration, including the ones who have previously been very vocal and vehement supporters of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, to create a framework where Zelensky is now basically someone who is showing that he's grateful to the United States and grateful to President Trump and willing to do what Trump wants to end the war.
And honestly, what choice did he have? I think what said everything was the Ukrainian diplomat. Her head was in her hands as she was essentially crying, knowing the kind of degree of mistakes Zelensky was making in front of the whole world on that stage in the White House where they knew that all the media would be around. That kind of said it all. So Zelensky really had no choice, but I think Glenn's right on the money here. If Putin turns down the ceasefire, they're going to try to portray him as, even worse than he already is, as justification for additional aid packages and more escalation in Ukraine.
And isolating Putin and forcing him to either accept what has been presented to him or be declared the actual real problem. Hoping that then Trump will view Putin as the problem, will side with Ukraine, and continue to provide support for Ukraine in a way that a lot of the people in his administration clearly hope will happen. Now, let me just say, I don't want to be too absolute about any of this, because it is the case that if Donald Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine, and I believe he does, I think that is something that he will pride himself on. He will consider it an important accomplishment. I hope he's able to succeed in that. I hope that the war in Ukraine ends. I do think Trump will deserve a lot of credit if he facilitates an end to this war, as he promised during the campaign he would.
And I think that's right. And I think it's his ego driving it. I think he more wants to solidify a peace between Ukraine and Russia than get the U.S. out of Ukraine. And because he'd view it as the best part of his legacy so far. It'd be hard to deny, by the way. But I think that's really what's driving Trump. And the thing that the real America First objective and perspective here is to just withdraw U.S. aid to Ukraine. That is so much more important. Peace will take care of itself after that. There's no way Zelensky could fight on. The European stuff is just hogwash. There's no way they'll be able to sustain this.
If you're going to do that, you do have to put pressure on Putin as well, and can't just put pressure on Zelensky, because it's not clear that Putin will make any sort of concessions that you might need him to make in order to reach a diplomatic agreement to the war. I was in Moscow, where I conducted several interviews, including the one we showed you with Professor Dugin. And one of the things I heard from not just him, but from many other people in Moscow, is that despite this cartoon and caricature that we often hear of Putin, that he's like some sort of totalitarian dictator, kind of like Kim Jong-un, where nobody can question the absolute leader. The reality is that Russia is a very complex country and always has been. There are competing factions. I'm not denying that Russia is authoritarian, not in any way suggesting there's open free speech and free debate, but there is a lot of opinion and a lot of influential factions who have a very strong view on the war in Ukraine and how it should or should not end. And Russians have been asked to make a great deal of sacrifice for this war. They have been isolated from the world. They have suffered tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of deaths. There have been huge numbers of young Russian men sent to a very difficult war, and this war has now gone on for 3 years. The Russians had to endure a lot in terms of sanctions and all sorts of other attempts to undermine and sabotage their economy, and they believe they're winning. And the front line is moving not toward Russia, westward, where Russian troops are being expelled, but slowly moving eastward, so that Russia now occupies something like 23 or 24% of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea, which they annexed in 2014. So having spent 3 years making a huge amount of sacrifice for this war, even if Putin wants to end the war by making a lot of concessions, there's a lot of political opposition and a lot of political tension that is very real and very substantial that will limit his ability to make the sort of concessions that he might want to make, because if there's a perception that he gave away too much to the West or too much to Ukraine after everything Russia invested in this war, and you can imagine all the war propaganda that the Russians have heard and how convinced they are of the importance of this war existentially to their national security, just like any country that's in a war does, those currents are going to be important, and they're things Putin has to overcome. And so if you're Donald Trump and the Trump administration, you do need to find ways to pressure Putin and pressure the Russian government in order to make some concessions, because they don't really necessarily have an inherent or obvious incentive to do so.
I think this point's so good too, because Biden and his regime was not trying. They wouldn't even talk to the Russians at all during the whole course of that war. But Trump actually did have a reasonable relationship with Putin, not reasonable to the extent that he was, some Russian agent like all the establishment left said, but that he worked with Putin in diplomatic situations. So I think Glenn's right here.
So I'm not suggesting this is all a ploy just to put Trump back on Zelensky's side and continue the war and continue U.S. support for it. I think that's a possibility. I do recognize last week and the week before, the Trump administration was pressuring Zelensky, was beating up Zelensky, and maybe they think now there's a need to isolate Putin and kind of gain some sentiment that the United States is blaming Russia and blaming Putin and might continue to arm the Ukrainians in order to put more pressure on Putin to come to the negotiating table, which is a perfectly valid way of trying to end a war. That's something that the Trump administration would almost have to do if it's going to succeed in ending the war. I just think people need to be very careful here, especially given the things that are being said about the possibility that what this really is about is trying to depict Zelensky as carrying out Trump's will and Putin as the one who's resisting it in order to get Trump back on Ukraine's side and willing to fund the war, as if none of all of this had actually happened.
And I do think that's the ultimate strategy of the neocons or the pro-war, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine people that you see that are pushing it. And it's not, a hive mind. We know that some others aren't really supporting the ceasefire, that, are big fans of NATO and Ukraine and want to do endless funding there, like John Bolton. But it is a lot of them, and I do think that's their gambit. I think that's their strategy. They're hoping that Putin's gonna, push back against this and look like, a wartime brute, and they'll be able to sell additional funding.
Now, there have been times where Putin had signaled his willingness to accept a ceasefire as long as it meant a freezing of the front lines, meaning that the Russians would essentially continue to occupy the parts of eastern Ukraine, the provinces in the Donbass, where there are a lot of Russian ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people who the Russian government believes needs protection. Here, for example, from Reuters in May of 2024, you see the headline, "Exclusive: Putin wants a Ukrainian ceasefire, but on the current front lines," meaning everybody just accepts that that's where the war will be frozen and the Russians will continue to remain the occupying force in that part of Ukraine that they have already ended up occupying.
Yeah, they're not leaving the Donbass provinces or Crimea. That's absolutely the case. This is not that big a surprise, I suppose. But it's interesting that Glenn brings it up.
And I don't think the West is going to be willing to accept that because, as we know, NATO and the U.S. from the beginning defined victory as expelling every Russian troop from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. And even though that was never realistic, if the West agrees to some sort of deal that even tacitly recognizes Russia's right to continue to occupy the parts of Ukraine that they're now occupying and leave Ukraine with what Professor Mearsheimer on our show several times has referred to as a rump state, it's kind of like the part of eastern Ukraine, of western Ukraine rather, that where Kiev is and where the more pro-Ukrainian anti-Russian population is, that would obviously be a victory for Russia and a defeat for the United States and for NATO.
All right, so what do you guys think? In this case, I think the ceasefire is trying to be used as a tool by those that want more Ukraine funding to, sell it in a propaganda sense where they can't sell it in a political sense yet. And they're hoping that, again, Putin pushes back. He looks like the dangerous brute that, just wants to take over all of Ukraine. They'll sell again. They'll bring up the stupid conspiracy theories like he's going to invade Poland tomorrow and reconstitute the USSR. All this unfounded, absurd stuff. But I don't know what's to come from this. I guess we'll have to see. But I would like to hear from all you guys in the comments below. Let me know, do you think this ceasefire is a good thing? From an America First U.S. perspective, do you think it's a good thing that this ceasefire would happen, or do you think that it's more likely to backfire and lead to more prolonged support for Ukraine? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, gotta repeat the motto of Liberty Vault. It's no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. So I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.